Let's talk Merrimack. I'm your host for today, Jen McInnes. I've lived in Merrimack for about 16 years, and this time of year, with all the rain and the snow melting away, my family is prepping for a new season of MYA soccer, so it is a good time of year. The goal of this show is to talk to you about things that concern Merrimack residents and encourage you to get involved in the town. Today's show focuses on school funding in New Hampshire, something top of mind for many Merrimack voters. Today, I am joined by Zach Sheehan, the Executive Director of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. Zach, would you like to tell us a little bit about how you got involved with this organization?
Yeah, so I'm from Concord, New Hampshire, grew up here. I went to the public schools in Concord. Like a lot of my peers, I left the state after high school to seek other places outside the state, but ended up back here about 10 years ago. And I've been involved in nonpartisan issue advocacy. I worked in the State House for a little bit in the legislature. And then I found this opportunity at the School Funding Fairness Project about 4.5 years ago. So I've been here ever since then, traveling around the state talking about school funding.
Fantastic. Something that struck me at a New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project presentation I attended in Milford recently was the focus on educating the public about the current situation and then proposing solutions, a step I think most folks don't quite get to when talking about school funding. So could you describe the mission of the School Funding Fairness Project?
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit organization based in Concord, have 4 staff right now. And really our mission and drive is twofold. One is to educate people about how school funding in New Hampshire works at a state level, both on the taxpayer side, because we rely really heavily on local property taxes, and also on the impact on student accessibility to different programs, the quality of the school, the amount of funding available, impact on programs like sports programs, teacher retention. It's really kind of the taxpayer and the student side. And we do that primarily by traveling around the state, talking to people about these issues. So like the presentation you saw in Milford, we've been doing those presentations. We've done hundreds of them all over the state the past 6 years. We do a lot of things like podcasts or different mediums like this to talk to folks. And it's a lot about trying to help people understand the basics of how the school funding system we have in New Hampshire, the decisions made at the State House in Concord, how those kind of create the reality that we all live in, the property taxes that we pay, the money that our school board and school districts have to work with. So it's a lot of just kind of talking about what might sound like complicated issues, but are really pretty straightforward issues that then have pretty significant impacts on all of our lives. I've yet to meet anyone in the state, I've been doing this for a while, that does not care about either school funding or housing costs, right? Because rent is impacted by property taxes too. And so it's kind of these issues really hit most people. So it's a lot of talking to folks. And then we also do advocacy. So we'll support a few bills, engage in a few bills at the State House each year, and try to help people understand about how to get connected in the legislative process, because it is very murky sometimes unless you do it full time like me and track all these things. It's hard to know when and how to testify in a bill if you want to, or talk to your representative or senator. So we do a lot of kind of like civic engagement too, and education about how to get involved in this process, because at the end of the day, that's what kind of changes public policy, is when folks get involved and talk to their reps.
Absolutely, and for reference, right, we look at about 1,000 bills every session.
Yeah.
And so the average voter cannot possibly parse through all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's my, again, it's my job to stay on top of these, and I cannot even come close to following all of them, let alone just all the bills that are related to education.
Yeah.
So it's a big volume of bills for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And at a recent meeting here in Merrimack focused on school funding, our state senator stated that whether it's at the state level or the local level, we are the taxpayers. This idea that it's the same people, whether we're looking at the state level or town level. My understanding, for example, of the statewide education property tax, though, is that it distributes the tax burden differently, especially when you think about property-rich and property-poor towns. So could you talk a little bit about how those state-level decisions, state-level policies impact our local tax rates?
Yeah. So a few things in there. First, kind of the statement made by your state senator, which actually is a concern or a thought brought up in the forms we do all over the state, right? So taxes have to come from somewhere. So we're talking about changing taxes or different revenues for public schools or less property taxes, then what? A lot of people say we pay taxes. The question though is who is going to pay those taxes? So the conversation is not do taxes come from places, it's where are they coming from? And I'll just give a quick example. There's been over the past 10 years or so, we've passed a lot of business tax cuts in this state. And the stated reason is you pass these business tax cuts that reduces the burden on businesses, right? And then they have more ability to move into a community, come into New Hampshire, hire workers, economic development, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
The problem is that we know from 10 years of doing this that the major beneficiaries of that are some of the largest international corporations in the country because they're getting a tax break on millions or billions of dollars of revenue, and that is a much bigger savings than your average Main Street business in Merrimack that might be saving a couple $100, couple $1,000, but now there's hundreds of millions of dollars less in state funds that could pay for better roads, better schools, more affordable housing. So, taxes do come from people and businesses, but the big question is who's paying those? And I think that's really where the kind of conversation should be focused in Concord. Relative to the statewide property tax, this is actually something that comes up a lot because it's confusing because it's called the statewide education property tax, but it is currently not a state tax. So it was introduced after the Claremont rulings to be a state tax to do exactly what you said. Raise money at the state level and then add that to the school funding adequacy formula so that more districts with higher levels of need and lower property values would get more funding. And so when it was introduced, we saw the average tax rate around the state drop by $4 per thousand. So you add a tax to everyone's bill, but the average bill goes way down because you paired it with funding based on need. So communities like Claremont, Newport got a lot more funding because they had really high tax rates and they were able to lower their local property tax rates. For about the past 12 years or so, it has they changed the law so it doesn't actually go to the state anymore. So now the statewide education property tax never actually leaves the bounds of the community, so to speak, which means that some communities, like Newcastle, for example, raise a ton of money with that $1 or so tax rate, way more than Merrimack does.
Right.
Per pupil, right? But they get to keep it all. So they raise a lot more than they keep everything that they raise, and then they can kind of offset their other taxes. Most communities don't have enough property value to be able to do that. So it's kind of a shell game at this point.
Wow.
But it could be changed back to be a better system if it were all to go to the state and we would add in some good exemptions, for example.
Yeah, I actually wasn't aware of that change.
Most people are not.
And that sort of undoes the whole purpose of
Yes.
SWEPT to begin with.
Yes.
And for anyone interested, there's great data on the website, and you can look at some actual numbers. At the Milford presentation, that tax rate's dropped by almost half with the introduction of the SWEPT tax, which was quite something. SWEPT isn't the only thing. There's lots of statewide policies. One that really intrigued me was the homestead exemption, which is something that I thought sounds so simple and could really help residents who are on a fixed income, who are some of the folks that, when we look at our tax rate, we really need to keep in mind. So could you talk a little bit about that and maybe some other funding solutions if you wanted to?
Yeah. So, one of the biggest things that we're seeing, especially in the past 5 or 6 years, where it's really been accelerated with home prices going up so much, is that folks, everyone's feeling the pinch, but largely people have been living in their homes for, at least 20 or 30 years, where the value now is far outstripping if they're on a fixed income or their income and their ability to pay for that.
Yeah.
So their homes, some people, homes price have doubled just in the past 5 years.
Yep.
And we are an aging population. We have a lot of folks that are retiring or are retired that are living in homes, for example, in Portsmouth. Just because you happen to live in Portsmouth does not mean you're rich. There are plenty of people who live in those communities where the values are going up at an astronomical amount. They're really having a hard time paying for those in communities all over the state. And so the idea of the homestead exemption is a pretty simple policy. And this is a good example of how a state level policy could impact your local taxes and your local tax burden is basically what it does is it takes a value of your home, some chunk of it, and says you won't pay taxes on that. So for example, the statewide property tax, if we were to make that a true state tax again, the state could then say, but I'm only going to tax you on anything valued more than 400 grand. So if my home is worth $500,000, I wouldn't pay any of the state tax on the first 400,000. If my home was worth $5 million, I also would get that $400,000 exemption, because in New Hampshire, everyone has to get equal exemptions like that.
Sure.
But that wouldn't go nearly as far on a $5 million home. So the idea is that would give a lot more relief towards to people who have more, kind of median or modest price homes. Really interesting thing about that is it's pretty easy to model, and we know where the break-even point is. So we could say, for example, with a $400,000 exemption, you wouldn't pay any more unless your home's worth more than $850,000 or so, $100,000. And if that's too low, then you can adjust it. So you there's the ability to fine tune that based on, again, going back to my earlier point, who do we think should be paying more or less than they are right now?
Right. And so there are quite a lot of different solutions floating around. This homestead exemption is an interesting one. There was recently, I think it was Andrew, his name's escaping me, but he was proposing coupling the property tax with an income tax and modeling to see how much more you would pay as an individual, if any. So it's good to know that we can run these models. There's a lot of great information on your website. It doesn't have any information about Merrimack yet, but I think Milford or Bedford might be some good school districts for folks to look at. What else on the website? So there's lots of financials, but what on the website might you highlight for people as educational resources?
Yeah, and so we kind of do deep dives in communities when we do presentations in the actual community. So a lot of our fact sheets, many of them will have kind of like every community in the state, and so you can kind of go see a town by town analysis around that. So that's why with Merrimack right now we don't have kind of like the in-depth there, but hopefully if we come to a presentation here we can provide some more kind of in-depth information. We do a lot of just like on our homepage, we'll have right in the bottom there's a section that just is the most recent like blog posts and updates. So that's a really good place for people who try to kind of give you a sense of what's happening in the legislature without it being so overwhelming that's just like a list of bill numbers, but just to kind of give an update on some of the big updates or big hearings coming up. We kind of serve as like the communications hub for the two school funding lawsuits. We're not part of them at all.
Okay.
We're not formally involved at all with them, but we just kind of, since it's right in our issue area, we make sure people know what's going on. What does this filing mean? What does this piece mean? Updates or reactions to different developments in the court cases. So there's some really helpful pieces there. Like for example, just a few weeks ago, the state appealed the decision in the Rand lawsuit, which came out last fall. And in that appeal, they asked the Supreme Court to overturn the Claremont rulings. And so that's like a pretty big update. It'll take another 12 to 18 months to resolve through the court system, but we try to give people the ability to stay updated on those cases as well.
To put a little bit of that in plain English, the Claremont ruling had to do with the state making sure that schools were fairly funded, regardless of the property values of the community. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, it was two parts. It was one, that the state of New Hampshire has an obligation to provide public education.
Okay.
So that was like baseline, the state's got to fund so kids have access to public schools.
Seems pretty uncontroversial, I would hope.
The second piece is that however the state decides to fund that, they have to use uniform taxes.
Okay.
And both of those rulings, the state's asking to overturn them so that there would actually be no legal responsibility for the state to provide public education.
Which could potentially undo the statewide adequacy funding, right?
Yeah.
That's that portion of state funding or of education funding that comes from the state that a different lawsuit had said was not adequate.
Right.
Is that right?
Right.
Okay. So a lot going on in education. One topic, a concern that's come up a lot at our school, it came up at our school deliberative session, it's on our school ballot actually, is the education freedom accounts. Could you talk a little bit about how that's playing a role in statewide policy?
Yeah, so for anyone not familiar, the education freedom accounts, they're also otherwise known as school vouchers, were passed in 2021. And basically what they are is they are a way for a parent who's sending their kids to a private school, or religious school, or homeschooling them to get public funding to go towards those expenses. And it's roughly $5,000 right now. It varies a little bit depending on the need of the child. But it was passed in 2021. The initial projected budget was about $900,000. It was $9 million that year. And it's kind of continued to expand. We just last budget removed the income limit. So initially these were proposed as a way for parents that are lower income to basically have more resources to afford private school.
Sure.
We just removed the income limit last year. So now anyone that is sending their child to a private school or homeschooling has access to these funds. And it's a big debate at the policy level. I mean, it's now $50 million a year, 4 years later, 5 years later. And the challenge is that we don't have a lot of money in this state. And so funding a entirely separate education system with the same pot of public funding from the state then makes it even harder to, for example, provide more funding for building aid. We just the past few years have reduced how much funding we're providing for building aid because we don't have enough money, but then we're also spending $50 million a year on a program kind of outside the public school system. So
Right.
it's happening all over the country. We see that the way New Hampshire is doing it is modeled after other states, where it's run through not a state agency, so you can't right to know request them. It's really hard to get data.
Right.
The nonprofit that runs it gets a 10% cut of all of the funding. And so it's a challenging piece, but it is a very contentious policy that is here in New Hampshire, and is something we're going to have. And so I think the question kind of is how much are we going to prioritize that versus funding our public education system more, or providing more building grants, or more funding towards communities with lower property values, et cetera.
Sure. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what someone learning about school funding, what they might do with this information.
Yeah.
What's the actionable goal here?
Yeah. First off, I would ask, do you pay property taxes, or do you pay rent? And do you care about your public schools? Right? So therefore, if you answered yes to any of those, these issues impact you.
Right.
They might feel a little more tangential. For example, if you rent, you don't see that property tax line. It might feel a little more tangential if you don't currently have kids in the public schools.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully for most folks the answer is yes, even if you don't have kids in the public schools, but you like going to the sports games or the theater performances. And so I would say if those things matter to you, there are policies being considered at the state level that will have really dramatic impacts on every one of those levels, good, bad, and ugly. And I think that if you're interested in that, for example, if you would not like your property taxes to go up, I would contact your local state rep, state senator. We have a lot of them in New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
They are, in general, very accessible. They're pretty busy, and they only get paid $100 a year, and they only have a few staff. But many of them folks might even know in town. And I just would really encourage people to talk to them, to connect with them, to ask them about what they're doing, to help with property taxes, to ask them what they're doing to engage in the public school system, because the biggest impact that is available for all of these levels is at the state level. The school boards in every single community I've ever been to in New Hampshire really do the best they can with a pretty restricted amount of flexibility.
Absolutely.
They get pretty limited funding from the state. They're all trying to manage property taxes. They know that that's the only lever they have to pull, and many of them are property owners themselves, and many times they're trying to moderate funding what they need for the schools versus pressure on local property taxes. And so really the amount of funding from the state and the state level policy is really what either will keep us in this box or kind of provide some more flexibility and breathing room. So just engaging with your local reps and senators is the best way I've ever seen to kind of move policy or these are really complicated issues. Yeah. I think that's something else I'd really like to stress is that, I have an organization that I work with. We have an agenda. We're very clear about it. We think there's some good solutions. We think there's some path forward. But we are far from the only voice and far from experts on everything on this. And so I think really encouraging your elected officials to take the time and energy to engage in what is a very complicated problem, but has really big ramifications for not only our property taxes, but our state. Yeah. I think that's really kind of getting those dialogues going might sound simple, but I just would encourage people, whatever your lived experience is, it matters, and you can talk to your state rep or state senator, and we can help you do that too. So feel free to reach out if you need help with that.
That's great. Yeah, thinking about affecting the state, we have a reputation, right? We're the 50th, I think, in the country for state funding to schools. That's not to say our schools aren't funded. It just falls on those local property taxes.
Yeah, if I could, I think that's a really interesting stat because we're the 50th in the country for state share of funding. Yeah. Many other metrics were in the top.
Yes.
And that is not because of the state funding, it's despite it. And I think that in my mind proves, especially in town meeting season that we're in right now, is that most people across the state in every type of community really value their public schools and are willing to pay more and really work at how to figure out this really challenging dilemma we're all in that produces, on average, very good public schools. The challenge is the gap between some of the schools that are struggling the most and some of the schools that are succeeding the most is really big.
Yeah.
And state policy is kind of what can help reduce that a good amount.
Absolutely. And it does feel a little like we've been pushing or kicking this can down the road long enough that we've hit a breaking point. Yes. I know here in Merrimack, we've had 2 default budgets, and this year our proposed budget is less than default because there really wasn't a good way forward. I think this is probably the time for that conversation and some solutions.
Yeah, and I would just say that I would encourage people to be weary if anyone says that there's a simple solution, including someone like me, right? Which might, some simple solutions that, are thrown out are just cut school budgets, right?
Right.
And that really does not get at how complicated this problem is and does not take into account the role the state has to play. Mm-hmm. And so it's not easy, but there are plenty of other models, some that we have in the state that we just don't utilize, and from other states around the country that we could use that could change how we do things. We don't have to do it this way. Right. We could change it. It doesn't mean it's easy, but there's plenty of ways to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have a slide with some ways to connect with the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project, and so take a look at those resources. You can get in touch with them. Check out the website. There's a lot of really great information on there. And I think, is there anything you would like to close on?
The last thing with the slide that's going up is please genuinely reach out if you agreed with me, if you disagreed with me, if you're somewhere in the middle. The whole point of our organization is to help support conversations, and sometimes we learn a lot from people who disagree with us, and that's having good dialogue and conversations is part of it. So really encourage people to reach out, and we'd love to do a presentation in Merrimack. That's always one of the most fun parts of my job, is getting to talk to a bunch of people about these issues.
Great.
So hopefully we can make that happen.
Fantastic. That sounds great. So thank you so much for taking the time
today.
Thanks
for having me.
Well, Merrimack, that's our show for today. We'd like to hear your input about the shows that we've had or ideas for other conversations. Reach out at talkmerrimack@gmail.com or follow us on socials at Talk Merrimack. We're on Facebook and Blue Sky, and you can find us on YouTube. I look forward to our next conversation.